At the beginning of the 16th century, Tudor London was a bustling city of around 60,000 inhabitants. The city came under the jurisdiction of the Lord Mayor and Sheriffs of London, whose job it was to maintain order and cleanliness. It was the most prosperous city in England, on account of it being a flourishing trading centre and an important port, and was by far the largest city in the country, rapidly becoming one of the biggest cities in Europe. To offer some comparison, the second largest city in Tudor England was Norwich, which at the beginning of the Tudor dynasty had a population of approximately 10,600. London or Londinium was founded in around 50 AD, although most historians agree that the region had been occupied for thousands of years before then. In about 200 AD, the Romans built a defensive wall and ditch around the city to protect its inhabitants from attack, and to also make it easier to collect tolls and taxes from citizens as they went and came about their business. These walls, around 6 metres high, remained long after Roman occupation ended and defined the boundaries of Tudor London, although by the 16th century the city's population had already begun to spill out beyond these limits, and two smaller towns lay outside the walls, Suffolk and Westminster, the seat of government. The ancient Roman walls enclosed a space of around 1 square mile and were bounded by open fields in the north and the Thames to the south. In this relatively small area, there were around 100 parishes, each comprising only of a few streets. Apart from the 100+ parish churches, there was also the great Cathedral of St. Paul and a number of other religious houses. The London skyline was dominated by spires and towers, the tallest of which was the steeple of St. Paul, which rose to around 460 feet, until it was destroyed in 1561 after being struck by lightning. Just outside the city walls to the east stood the Tower of London, as it still does to this day. Immediately beyond the wall was the ditch, a cause of constant headache for authorities, who despite their best efforts were unable to dissuade people from using it as a sewer and a dumping ground. One can just imagine the smell that emanated from there. The city wall extended from Tower Hill in the east to Blackfriars in the west and was punctuated by 7 main gates: Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Moorgate, which wasn't built until 1415, Cripplegate, Aldersgate, Newgate and Ludgate. These were not gates in the modern sense, but rather multi-storey buildings that contained an archway or two for traffic to pass through, and were protected by portcullis and other defensive features. They often served as accommodation, and in the case of Cripplegate, Aldersgate, Ludgate and Newgate, as prisons too, but perhaps their most grisly function was as a place to display the dismembered body parts of traitors. In June 1497, the leaders of the Cornish rebellion were hung, drawn and quartered at Tyburn, about a 3-mile walk west of the city, and some of their limbs nailed to the city gates. There was also a gate at the southern end of London Bridge, where the severed heads of traitors were regularly displayed. After curfew rung by the bells of St. Mary le Bow and other churches at around 9 p.m. in summer and dusk in winter, the gates were locked for the night and not reopened until dawn. During this time, no one was permitted entry into the city, and those inside the walls had to leave the streets and return to their homes. This was undoubtedly the safest place to be anyhow after dark. The narrow and crowded streets of Tudor London could be very dangerous. The threat of meeting some unsavoury character was a very real possibility, but it was not your only concern. Apart from the principal streets, most were unpaved and their surfaces uneven. At times they were made almost impassable by ruts and holes. Those streets that were cobbled were often slippery and muddy and difficult to navigate, especially in the dark. It's a little wonder that Londoners only ventured out after curfew in exceptional circumstances. As for cleanliness, in theory each citizen was required to keep the space in front of his or her house relatively clean. Whether this was strictly adhered to is uncertain. Like today, there would have been those householders that took extra pride in the appearance of their street frontage, and others whom did not. While some of the larger houses had enclosed latrines that emptied into deep cesspits, most would have made do with a bucket or a clothes store, which would be emptied daily into a stream or a river, or into the ditch surrounding the city. The twisting lanes and alleys were dark even on the brightest day, because Tudor homes were built with the first floor overhanging the street, so close in fact that from your first floor you could almost touch your neighbour across the street. Apart from being gloomy and almost certainly smelly, the streets were also very noisy. Church bells dictated the day's activities, market bells rang to mark the beginning and end of trading, tradesmen and peddlers shouted about their wares to passers-by, animals, namely pigs, roamed freely, and the town criers delivered the latest news. Probably noisiest of all were the metal workers, including the blacksmiths, the farriers, and the cutlers, whose clanging and hammering could be heard from a distance. A walk around Tudor London would have been an assault on the senses. The city was also a place of contrasts. While many of the alleys were narrow and lined with humble homes, where the poor of London lived, other streets were wide and bordered by grand 4- and 5-story residences that boasted glass in all their windows, home to the city's rich merchant population. Cheapside was one such street. It was the widest street in Tudor London, the principal marketplace, and home to a number of conduits, including the Great Conduit, a large stone fountain where each day people lined up to collect their water. It was also an important part of the ancient coronation route from the Tower of London to Westminster. The congested streets and insalubrious back alleys meant that whenever possible Londoners preferred to travel by water. The main thoroughfare in the heart of the city was the Thames. There, Londoners or visitors could hire a wherry to take them up and down the river, where at any one time there could be hundreds of vessels, ranging from small wherries to dungboats and large merchant ships. About 20 or so quays and wharves lined the north bank of the river from the Tower up to London Bridge. This ancient monument contained 20 arches, and until the 18th century was the only bridge to traverse the Thames in London. It had buildings which included houses, public toilets, a chapel, and shops, running almost its entire length, and in the 16th century was considered one of the great wonders of the world. By the end of the Tudor reign, the population of London is estimated to have quadrupled and risen to somewhere in the vicinity of 200,000. As the result of serious overcrowding and poor public sanitation, Tudor Londoners suffered from many diseases, including smallpox, measles, malaria, typhus, and dysentery. Outbreaks of the dreaded sweating sickness also occurred throughout this period. Regardless, as the hub of trade and industry and the centre of literature and the arts, it continued to draw people from all over the country and abroad. The historian John Stowe described it as the fairest, largest, richest, and best inhabited city of the world. I hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into life in Tudor London.